I will work day in and day out.
Wake up and smell the coffee.
We want to return to the European Union.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Green, a Community Organiser for Acorn the Union, a Communications Officer for Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust, and a Communications Officer for Seasalt Housing Co-operative. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today.
It's great to have you on. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, how do you define community housing? How do we define it? What would you say is the definition of community housing?
So, community-led housing can broadly be defined as a development that is driven by, built for, and or owned by a local community. So, when we're talking about community-led housing, we're talking about housing that offers something for people on a range of different incomes or for specific groups of people. So, you might have community-led housing that works for people on low incomes, people who are part of the LGBT community, people who are part of ethnic minority communities. Community-led housing can work for people who want to rent or buy property, so that covers both of those sets of people. And there are different types of community-led housing projects that we can have. So we've got things like co-housing, cooperatives, community land trusts, and self-build, which I think we'll probably come on to in a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So why do you think community housing is needed? What do you think is the reasoning behind the need for it?
So I think in general, when we're talking about housing, the media sort of covers housing in a way that suggests that there's only sort of one way out of the housing crisis. So we always hear headlines about missed housing targets, dodgy landlords, and poor housing conditions, and a lot of noise about not being able to build enough houses. But I think community-led housing, with this big national discussion around housing, we obviously need to build housing and build a lot more housing. But we also need to build well, we need to build green, and we need to build affordable, and we need to get local communities on board. So community-led housing developments have quite a strong history of offering housing that's definitely more affordable, more democratic, more well-built, using modern building methods and modern construction techniques, and greener. So I think community-led housing provides an opportunity to deliver homes in places and on sites where traditional sort of commercial developments aren't viable, or where there's strong community interest in developing a site as opposed to a commercial site.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, how do you think people who might not know about community housing could get involved with it? Because of course the operative word is community, isn't it? How do these communities ensure that they can get together and get this housing done? What's the actual process in getting the community to work together in order to get the houses built?
Sure. So there, as I said before, there are a variety of types of projects that community-led housing can take hold under, and that really depends on what kind of developments the community are looking to build. Usually communities will set up either a cooperative or a community land trust type development, or another sort of third sector organisation which helps the community access the infrastructure, so the campaigning tools, the outreach and networks and the contacts. It helps them bridge the gap between them and the local authority, so political engagement, and it also helps them access the capital to deliver these projects. What usually happens is people identify a need for community-led housing or housing development, and they will then decide what kind of projects they want. So I guess we can come on to talk about what kind of projects those might be. So we could be looking at a co-housing scheme, which are like self-contained houses with shared facilities. So that would be like an affordable housing project where everyone owns their own flat. We could be talking about cooperatives, where a house is built, self-built or renovated and managed by members of a group who have democratic control over the scheme. And they can either own that through shared ownership or an affordable rent proposal. And we're talking about community land trusts, community land trusts is where land is kind of held by the community in perpetuity and stewarded in the long-term interests of the community. So yeah, those are the kind of different schemes that communities can use to kind of kickstart projects. And then from there, you can kind of get going on what kind of product you want to see, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned local authorities there, but I mean, how much enthusiasm do you see from local authorities, members of parliament to these kinds of schemes? Is there much enthusiasm from different MPs and different local authorities, or is it a bit more muted?
I would say that community-led housing is definitely an underexplored and underinvested in sector at the moment. So just to go to what the government have been doing first, the government launched a community-led housing fund in 2016, and I think they roughly made available around £165 million of funding for community-led housing projects across the country. And that funding was put into two stages. So the first stage of that funding really allowed projects to get off the ground. So that would help them set up organisations, identify sites, and deal with all sort of the administrative costs like surveyors' fees, legal fees, etc., etc. And then the second half of that funding was actually capital funding to help them build the projects. So building the houses, accessing mortgages, that kind of stuff. So central government did initially put in a lot of enthusiasm into community-led housing and made funding available. However, come I think it was 2022, they pulled that funding, what was left of it, and stopped pipelining any additional funding. So I think with the current government and the current economic climate, we've seen a kind of initial enthusiasm and more recently a kind of lack or withdrawal of that enthusiasm. Locally, where I live in Brighton and Hove, both of our MPs in Kemp Town, Lloyd Russell Moyle from the Labour Party, and in Pavilion, Caroline Lucas of the Green Party, have been supportive of community-led housing projects. The City Council, cross-party, are also very enthusiastic about developing vacant sites for community-led housing. So we've had a lot of good words locally about community-led housing, and the City Council have pledged as part of their manifesto to deliver more community-led housing. So we're seeing at a local level where I live, particularly from areas where Labour and perhaps the Greens, so more progressive parties are involved, you're seeing enthusiasm. But again, as I said, cross-party, so we have had some Conservatives in Brighton enthusiastic about community-led housing as well, which is helpful. And it shows that there are definite benefits that are visible from community-led housing if everyone cross-party is getting on board. And then nationally, we've been, as part of the projects I've been involved in, setting up the first student housing co-op in the southeast, Seasalt Housing Co-op. We've been contacted by various local authorities and MPs who are interested in what we're doing and want to set up similar schemes where they are. So, for example, we were contacted by the housing cabinet member on Liverpool City Council, who was part of their they did a massive land evaluation in Liverpool, and as part of that, they wanted to develop community-led housing projects, and a sort of subsection of that community-led housing focus would be a student housing co-op in Liverpool City. So we have attracted a lot of attention with what we're doing, and I think there is enthusiasm. And that reflects in the policy. So there's now a network of councils that run this thing called the Co-op Councils Innovation Network. So that is where local authorities can access funding and support to develop cooperative projects. So that's not specific to community-led housing, but that just shows that projects that are running this cooperative model are sort of lifting off the ground a bit more. Recently.
Absolutely. Just to return to the, you mentioned the funding that was set aside by the government in 2016. How much of that do you think, before the plug was pulled, was actually used, and how effectively advertised do you think the scheme was?
I think the scheme was definitely effectively advertised to people in the sector. So when I was involved in community-led housing, obviously people involved in Brighton Hove Community Land Trust, where I live, or people trying to set up cooperatives, are always on the lookout for government support and are always looking out for ways they can access additional funding through grants or community shares or whatever that may be. So I definitely think it was easy for us to find out about it, but I don't think it was very easy for people who perhaps didn't know so much about community-led housing to find out that this was available and that they were able to build these community-led schemes in their area. So I definitely think the government could have gone on a bigger drive to promote these community projects, and the kind of consensus build more community engagement in development nationwide, because I think a lot of the animosity towards new developments comes from a lack of community involvement, a lack of community consensus on what's being built and where. So in that regard, I think this fund could have been better advertised. And I do believe that almost all of the fund was actually used. We've got about £60,000 to £65,000 towards Seasalt Housing Co-op, which was incredibly useful and helped kickstart our whole project. So I think I'm not sure exactly on the figures of how much was used, but I think almost all of it was used. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned Seasalt there and housing cooperatives, student housing cooperatives. How important do you think it is that students, particularly when you're going off to university, starting to rent for the first time, have that kind of support from student cooperatives and are able to go to them if they're in need? How important do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's very important, actually. I think it's a very innovative and new way of living for students. Currently, I think there are two ways really that most people live at university, and that is either in student halls and university managed accommodation, or in the private rental sector. And then I guess there are a few smaller number of people who live at home whilst they're at university, who either live in the city where they study or studying for an online degree. But the student housing co-op really offers a completely different way of living to the traditional university style. So in this way, you as a student, a cooperative is managed by its residents. So the people that live in the house collectively manage and make the decisions about how the house is run. So you don't have a landlord, and any decisions that a landlord might normally make are made by these members as a collective group. So they hold general meetings maybe every week or every 2 weeks or once a month, where they will come together, they will assign roles to each other, and then they will make these decisions. So students living in a cooperative can, in a way, it helps that people build their independence. It helps people learn new skills. So, for example, at Seasalt, we've had a lot of interior design work going on, people painting the walls, people putting up shelves. So students living in the co-op are able to learn these kind of new DIY skills, able to learn how to manage house finances. So everyone at Seasalt is given a role within the co-op. So you have a chair, a treasurer, a rent officer. So, for example, the treasurer is able to learn skills around finance, managing the books, collecting rent, and that kind of thing. So, it enables students to learn new skills. It gives them a collective voice in their living situation. And of course, housing co-ops are obviously built to high standards. So Seasalt is energy efficient, it's green, so they get good quality accommodation, and it's also affordable. So we try and set rents close to local market rate, and then the excess rents that are generated are reinvested back into the project. And as part of their rent collection, the students at the house get a yearly budget. So I think they get £2,000 a year, which they can spend collectively. So then again, that gives students the ability to make their own decisions and spend that money in a way that they want to spend it, rather than having to rely on the landlord or a university housing provider to make those decisions for them.
I mean, how receptive have universities, do you think, been to student housing cooperatives, and how much support have they given to them?
I don't think there's been that much support given on a national scale. So at Seasalt, we were lucky that we engaged with the university early on through the Students' Union, and they gave us a grant fund of £10,000 to help us start our project. Other than that, I don't think I know of almost any universities nationwide that have really helped kickstart any of these projects. So the largest student housing co-op in the UK is Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, and they actually they actually manage old university halls in Edinburgh. So they have over 100 rooms that they can provide to people. But I think they do that through a housing association that bought the halls off the university rather than from the university directly. So in terms of actual support by universities, I don't think, other than what we've done, I can't think of any projects for student housing co-ops that have been supported by the higher education sector so far.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's solely a case of the universities making money from student housing and so aren't receptive to something like this? Or do you think that it's simply that universities aren't aware of schemes like this and so don't know how to necessarily encourage them?
I think it's a bit of both. in a way. I think first and foremost, there aren't many student housing co-ops in the UK. So not every university town or city has a student housing co-op available or a group willing to and ready to set one up. So in that regard, where there isn't one, there's not going to be a university that's that engaged. So I think we first need to think about how we market student housing co-ops, and perhaps we need to do more outreach in students' unions and to university hierarchies across the country to kind of promote the benefits of having a student housing co-op in your setup. Yeah, and then secondly, as you say, universities are providing a lot of student housing, and it's obviously these days quite expensive. So I know at the University of Sussex, for example, there was a lot of contention between the students and the university around the gentrification of what they saw, the gentrification of some of their accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
So the university, what was known as East Slope at the University of Sussex, the old East Slope and the old Park Village accommodation, was knocked down and replaced by new expensive accommodation. So the cheapest accommodation on campus then suddenly became the most expensive. So people who needed affordable accommodation couldn't get it. And I think there is definitely a tendency of university hierarchy, because universities aren't funded by central government so much anymore, and a lot of universities are looking for new ways for funding. They're obviously going to be more receptive to housing schemes that give them long-term financial stability, rather than trying to channel money into projects that don't perhaps give them that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about cooperatives more widely.
Mm-hmm.
Cooperatives are obviously something that have been around for a very long time, have a storied history. Do you think that there has been a revival in appreciation of the cooperative and the cooperative model in the past few years, as compared to, say, in the 1980s and the 1990s, where it was seen as not only very old-fashioned, but perhaps a bit, not necessarily working in the best way, perhaps unprofitable, all these kinds of things? Do you think that we've seen a turnabout and people are becoming much more in favour of cooperative models, not just in terms of student housing co-ops, but also in terms of cooperatives at stores, cooperative banks, that kind of thing?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the 1980s and the 1990s were characterised by the rise of Thatcher and then New Labour, both of whom I think weren't that conducive towards cooperative forms of development. I definitely think there is a tendency for a more neoliberal approach with those two governments, which perhaps didn't allow for the growth of community schemes and cooperatives. Mm-hmm. But coming towards sort of the mid 2000s and then the early sort of 2010s, I think after the global financial crash and with the economic conditions as they are, a lot of people were looking for alternatives to the status quo and alternative economics. And I think largely in the sort of the last 20 years, community land trusts and cooperatives have kind of grown out of the US mostly. Mm-hmm. So we've seen projects like in Jackson, Mississippi, where the locals are trying to build a whole cooperative network to resist corporate developments. Again, there's one of the largest cooperatives in Europe is the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain. So yeah, people are looking for something different. And I think as people turn to things like community wealth building and kind of like looking for local authorities to use their money responsibly and use their money in a more progressive procurement kind of fashion, where they support local businesses and support local needs more. Cooperatives definitely have a role to play in that, and I think that the growth of those kind of ideals has led to a growth in cooperatives more widely.
How much do you think that the growth of cooperatives, the growth of interest in community land trusts, community housing, is linked to a desire for greater devolution, a desire for local communities and more areas that have perhaps not seen as much attention paid to them by national government, want to try and get that kind of power and that kind of like local decision making back to them, because they know that they will be able to do things that will be more beneficial to their community, rather than necessarily leaving it up to Member of Parliament, Westminster government, who might not necessarily help them in the way that they need to with support, infrastructure, that kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. So I think the two biggest driving forces at the moment are the market and the state in terms of the way things are built in this country. And I think people who are in sort of left behind areas, or even people in invested areas, are looking for a way that they can take more control over decision making. and kind of make their own projects. I definitely think economic devolution is becoming more and more popular amongst people in the UK. People are looking for a way that, in terms of community-led housing projects, we're looking for a way that land can be more easily accessed and acquired by local people with local interests, and they want to find a way that they can ensure the benefits are shared equally among local people, among members, and that profits are reinvested back into local community and not passed on to people like shareholders and external benefactors. A lot of people in areas of the north or in coastal communities have seen a lot of the wealth and a lot of the traditional opportunities in their towns and cities has been lost over the last 20, 30, 40 years. A lot of areas are now much more deprived than they used to be. And I think recently I saw a good graph in the Financial Times that was explaining how the GDP output of the UK is very London-centric. And without London, the UK would be much poorer than most major European economies, and much poorer. Most regions in the UK are much poorer in terms of GDP output than the poorest state in the US, which is, I think, Mississippi. So in that way, I think these people are kind of looking for a way to kind of draw on the resources of that very London-centric economy and devolve economic power out to their local community. So they want to so in this way, they want to promote economic devolution, economic resilience, and a kind of community wealth building approach where profits are kind of reinvested in local communities.
Absolutely. And just turning back to the question of housing, I know as you mentioned that Seasalt is obviously very keen on ensuring that any housing built is environmentally efficient, that it doesn't have a massive impact on the environment. How important do you think it is that environmental standards in housing are kept up? And what do you think is the balance that can be struck between needing to build more housing and ensuring that there is a sustainable growth in wildlife, in the environment, and reaching the net zero target?
Sure. I think as part of the community housing fund that the government did, one of their stipulations was that housing projects should be built with modern building standards and sustainable building methods. So I've been involved in a project in Brighton, Hove, which is called Housing Co-op, and the theme of their project was to build a kind of cabin in the woods style in the middle of a city, using these kind of Scandinavian building standards to what was called passive house, so essentially almost carbon neutral. So I would encourage anyone to have a look at, Bunker Housing Co-op, and you can see for yourself, like they do open days as well, if you're ever around in Brighton and Hove, sometimes. But essentially their house is built with using a material called cross-laminated timber, which is both a really good insulator, but also really breathable in the summer. So, and they've also got things like, they've worked with Brighton Hove Energy Services Cooperative to kind of use an innovative lease system to get solar panels on the roof. They use ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps to heat their house. So they were telling me that in the winter, they don't even need to put the heating on because their house is that energy efficient. And they built this project on a brownfield site in the middle of a housing estate in the Elm Grove area. So this is an area that used to be fenced off by the local authority and used to be kind of a fly tipping site. So you can imagine it was very sort of unsightly and perhaps disused area. And so I think when we're looking at housing projects and we're looking at building, there is definitely a need to identify areas like brownfield sites where we can build modern building standards, modern construction methods. Bunker was built on a fairly affordable budget, and they self-built it themselves. So I definitely think we can build green, we can build sensibly, and we can build smart. And I think most of all, it's about consensus building. So we need to start the discussions now between all the stakeholders involved. So local communities, charities, wildlife trusts, environmental groups, and people who are going to be building these houses need to get around the table and kind of forge a consensus path forward. But at the moment, I think we're kind of playing everyone off one another. People are saying, well, if we need to build more houses, we'll have to sacrifice the environment. And environmental groups are saying, well, in that case, we'll have to stop all housing developments to kind of protect the environment. And I think there is a way forward where we can kind of find the middle ground, where we protect the environment and we promote good and environmental building standards, but also we build as much as possible, which is what we need to do.
Absolutely. How important do you think it is to have flexibility over the types of houses that are built? So, for example, you mentioned the Bug Hill development there, but other examples like tiny houses, they're very popular in the United States at the moment. Some have been brought over into the UK as well. Different types of multi-storey accommodation, not necessarily the kind of blocks of flats that were built in the 1960s or 70s, but much more environmentally friendly multi-storey flat accommodation. Do you think it's important that we focus on flexibility in terms of the types of housing that we're building, as much as ensuring that we build as much houses as possible?
Yeah, 100%. Because I think every site you find will be different, and every site you find will have different opportunities available. When we were looking at properties for Seasalt Housing Co-op, we first started looking at places like old disused hotels, disused B&B. And I think community housing groups are quite innovative in the way they can access sites, but you probably wouldn't traditionally think of as areas where housing might be built. A lot of local authorities, however, are quite reluctant to fund projects like that, because they're concerned about things like planning gain, where people gain where if you turn commercial into property overnight, you get a big windfall in terms of its value. There are definite issues in terms of trying to identify novel ways of building and novel site access, and those issues need to be ironed out first before we decide, before we start just opening up complete flexibility. But but as you say, it's definitely good to have different flexible building styles, and community projects in particular tends to be much more flexible and much more innovative in the way that they build than traditional projects. So using modern building methods and using innovative types of housing is definitely the way forward.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, Tom. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me, but I do have one final question for you. What do you think is the biggest concern that you have in terms of the future of housing in Britain? What do you think is the biggest risk or biggest danger that we have for the future of housing in the UK?
I think the biggest concern is that we continue on the same path that we've been going on, with this emphasis on individualisation, these large-scale private developments that don't serve the interests of the local community and aren't affordable. And I think if we carry on down that path, we'll end up in a situation where no one can ever have the chance to own their own home. People don't have a sense of community. People don't have these kind of innovative and modern building houses to live in. So I think continuing down the same trajectory is my biggest concern. And I think in terms of going forward, I think we need to build quality green housing that is in the interests of local communities.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast, Tom. If people want to find out more about you, where should they go to find out more about you?
You can check out seasalthousingcoop.com. You can go on Brighton Hove Community Land Trust, and you can also follow me on Twitter as well, Tom Green on Twitter. So
fantastic. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.